last day we looked into citation analysis in general, and we started off with this idea of quantifying interdisciplinarity in computer sciences, and we already saw this measure of reference diversity index. So, using this measure we tried to see if there is a field F, what is the proportion of references that this field F is giving to different other fields, and if this proportion is very diverse in terms of the entropy value, then we assume that that particular field F is more interdisciplinary than some field which puts all its references to one or two other single fields. Okay, so that's a notion in which that's one type of notion for quantifying interdisciplinarity. Now, since we know that the citation network is a directed graph, so if there are references which is like outgoing edges, so we are assuming that there is a field F and there are outgoing edges like this, which we were dividing into proportions. So, if this is the field F for which we were trying to quantify interdisciplinarity, we were saying like how many of its outgoing references, outgoing edges go to some field F1, some another field F2, a third field F3, and so on. And in this way, based on these proportions, we tried to quantify the reference diversity index. Similarly, if you consider another field, the picture of the same field F, but now receiving citations from different other fields. So, what I am trying to say is that these two factors are like sides of the of a coin, are the two sides of a coin. So, one is where you are looking at the outgoing edges, basically the references going out of F, the references that are made by the papers in F to all other different fields, whereas here you see what is the citations that the papers of field F receive from all other different fields. So, maybe from field F1 it receives 3 citations, from field F2 it receives 2 citations, and then there is another field F3 from which it again receives 3 citations. So, this is also another way which one could use to quantify the notion of interdisciplinarity. That is, if you are getting citations from various other fields, then there is a higher chance that you are an interdisciplinary field, whereas if you are getting most of your citations from one particular field or at best 2 fields, then there is a chance that you are not so interdisciplinary in nature. So, this can be again quantified by something called the citation diversity index. So, here what you do, you find out the proportion of citations that are coming from the different fields, okay, the fraction of citations that are coming from the different fields to the field F, and once you have derived all these proportions, you can again find out the entropy of these fractions, and that will tell you how diverse its citation is. But then there is one difference between the reference diversity index and the citation diversity index. What is this difference? So, note that the outgoing edges, once a paper is written, whatever references you put in are fixed forever. So, once the paper is written and it is published, the set of references does not change. Okay, that means the number of outgoing edges from a particular paper, once the paper is published, do not change. So, these remain fixed over time. So, the reference set here, okay, of F does not change over time. In this particular figure, the reference set does not change over time by definition, whereas citation on the other hand might increase over time. That is, like F might get 10 citations from different fields in the first year, another 10 in the next year, another 10 in the third year, and so on and so forth. Okay. So, in this way the volume of citations actually increases over time for F, whereas the volume of references going from F remains same for a particular paper. from a particular paper. Okay, so if you consider one particular paper in the field F, the reference set of that paper is fixed and this does not change, whereas the citation set for this paper might increase over time. This paper might be more and more cited over time. Okay, so this is a prime difference. So for the citation diversity index, we not only look at the raw values, but we look at the temporal differences of the citation diversity index. So we compute the citation diversity index, say at the current year Y, then again after 2 years we compute the citation diversity, and then we define the difference. Now you can keep a window of 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, and so on and so forth. Okay, so every year you might calculate the citation diversity index and find out the difference. Okay, so this here the time window assumed is 1 year. Now if you try to identify the difference after 2 years, the time window will be 2 years, and so on and so forth. For our analysis, we assume that the time window is set to 1 year, that is, we are trying to see what is the increase or decrease in citation diversity over a period of time taking 1 year gap. Okay, so if you try to do that, so we have already discussed how to define citation diversity. It's again the proportion of papers from different fields citing the papers in a particular field, log pj. So sum over all such proportions, sum over all pj log pj, where j is a particular field. Now this actually defines the entropy. The notion is exactly similar to the reference diversity index. Now since this is a time varying quantity, what we do is we find out difference in CDI values over consecutive time periods. Here in this case, for our analysis, we have kept the time period equal to 1. Now if you try to plot this CDI differences, you see certain interesting patterns as you see here. So what happens is the difference initially remains low, then there is a point where the difference spikes up, okay, and then again it stabilizes. So what happens, so and you see it for all the different fields, mostly those are those which are assumed to be in general interdisciplinary, like natural language processing, which is like a mixture of knowledge from linguistics, knowledge from information retrieval, knowledge from algorithmic techniques, knowledge from machine learning. So all these combined actually develops the field of natural language processing. So that's really a truly interdisciplinary field. Similarly, the World Wide Web, which actually borrows concepts from graph theory, security, distributed systems, and a lot of other areas. Now for each of this, what you see that there is a once you move across the timeline, since as we said that the CDI is a time varying quantity, so as you move across the timeline, each of them show a spike at certain point. Now what can be interpreted from this? So you see that initially the citation diversity index is low, at one point it rises, therefore the difference spikes up. So at this point the citation diversity suddenly grows, that is the field has suddenly become highly interdisciplinary. So at this point the difference between the CDI values at the previous point and the next point is high, so the difference spikes up, the value spikes up. Now then in the immediate next time point, the difference again falls down, which means that whatever CDI was achieved at this point is maintained. That's why the difference again falls down. So here say the CDI value was some number x, here the CDI value becomes some number y. So the difference of y minus x is very very high, that's why there is a spike. Now at this point probably the CDI value becomes z, and the difference z minus y is again small because z is as high as y. So the high CDI is maintained. Since the high CDI is maintained, you see that there is a drop in the difference, so the difference becomes again low. As the two consecutive time points, the CDI values are high. Here between these two consecutive time points, this was a low CDI, this was a high CDI, that's why there was a spike. Now the spike falls because after that point the same CDI value, roughly the same CDI value is maintained, and therefore the rest of the difference as you see is a stable curve. So similar observation holds for all other different fields. Now in this way you can define various metrics actually to identify or to quantify the notion of similarity. Okay, so the next measure that we will get introduced to is the number of new authors coming into a field, coming into a particular field. So we have already said that interdisciplinarity is the talk of the day. So people are driven more and more towards interdisciplinary research. Okay, new researchers who are entering in the field are trying to be more and more interdisciplinary in nature, and if that is so, then there will be more number of authors, okay, who are writing interdisciplinary papers, more number of new authors who are writing interdisciplinary papers. Okay, so what we try to do is that we try to see that in every year what is the total number of new authors that are entering into the system of writing papers. Okay, and we see in what fields they actually join much. Okay, so we see like whether most of the new authors who have joined the computer science field, whether most of them have joined natural language processing, World Wide Web or operating systems. That is the question that we are trying to ask. So the bunch of new authors who start doing research, okay, and start writing papers in computer sciences, we try to ask out of this what proportion are writing papers in interdisciplinary, known interdisciplinary areas, whereas what proportion are writing papers in the core areas of computer science. So if you try to look at this proportion, you see again some interesting patterns. What you see is that in the earlier years of computer science, like in 1975 to 79, most of the authors, most of the new authors who joined the field, who joined this domain of computer science, joined in areas of operating systems, distributed systems, security, etc. However, as time progresses, more and more interdisciplinary areas come at the top rank. So these fields here are ranked by the proportion of new authors that are joining that field. In computer science, what is the proportion of new authors that are joining a particular field? That actually is used as a quantity to decide this ranking. So as you see, initial years mostly core fields like operating systems, distributed systems, security, etc., or networks are the areas in which actually more and more new authors have joined. However, as time progresses and you are in the era of 2004 to 2008, what you see is that mostly interdisciplinary areas like bioinformatics, World Wide Web, data mining, natural language processing, these are the areas which are known to be more interdisciplinary in nature. There are more and more fraction of new authors, novice authors joining these areas. Okay, so that's again an indication of interdisciplinarity. So now we use all these factors, the reference diversity index, the difference in the citation diversity index, the attraction index, which is the total number of new authors joining a particular field in a year. So all these factors we use to actually identify a particular field. So each field actually is represented by a vector of numbers. Now this vector consists of the reference diversity index, the delta citation diversity index, and the attraction index. So these three factors actually define each particular field. Now based on this vector space, so now each field is can be represented by these three numbers, which is like a vector. Now if you represent this, all the fields of computer science, all the 24 fields that we have of computer science in the vector space, and do a clustering, you see an interesting structure emerging like this. So the red ones, the red bubbles here in this picture, are the ones which are known to be core fields of computer science, like for instance algorithms, operating systems, architecture. These are more and more the core areas. These are known to be core areas of computer science, whereas the green bubbles here are known to be more interdisciplinary areas like World Wide Web, natural language processing, computer vision, bioinformatics, and fields like that. So fields which actually incorporate ideas from various different domains. Bioinformatics actually incorporates ideas from biology, from computer science, from different branches of computer science, in fact data mining, algorithms, graph theory, and so on and so forth. So these fields are truly interdisciplinary, and as we see that given these three factors, reference diversity index, difference of the citation diversity index, and the attraction index, given these three quantities representing each field as a vector, nicely differentiates the core fields from the interdisciplinary fields of computer science. So that's unsupervised method, but by which we can identify those fields which are interdisciplinary in computer science compared to those which are the more known to be core fields. Okay. So there is another interesting thing that happens. So look at this figure. What I show here is basically the evolution of the growth of two different fields. So there are two fields that we consider. In the top panel we consider the field of World Wide Web, and in the bottom panel we consider the field of programming languages. So and the bubbles here show the fraction of citations that are going from the World Wide Web to different other fields. So what you see in 75 to 84, in this particular decade, what happens is that the most of the citations from the World Wide Web papers actually go to the databases. Okay, most of the citations coming out from most of the references from the World Wide Web actually go to the databases. In the next decade, what you see, it's not only databases but also information retrieval, where many of the citations from World Wide Web goes. However, in the last decade, what you see is that while there is already some fraction of citations that is going to databases, data mining, etc., there is a large fraction of citations that is going to the World Wide Web itself. So this is the point where we see that World Wide Web itself has emerged to be a big field. Since 1975 to 1994, what we observe is that World Wide Web is probably still a small field in its infancy. Most of the papers that are written in this field, they do their references, they give most of their references to other fields like databases or data mining, etc. Whereas in the last decade, what we see that World Wide Web itself has grown into an entity, and many of the references are held within World Wide Web itself. Many of the references do not go outside World Wide Web. Now the fraction of citations that World Wide Web was providing to the other fields have reduced, while the fraction of citations of World Wide Web to itself has increased. So that's the typical growth phenomena, evolution phenomena of a interdisciplinary field. Whereas if you look at the core field, which is programming language is more like a core field. It has existed in the computer science domain for quite long time, and there is hardly any such evolution that is observed there. You see, it's more or less stable. Its fraction of citations to different fields is more or less stable over time, mostly coming to the programming language field itself. Okay, so that is happening for all the 3 decades there. So this actually shows a striking difference between the evolution of the interdisciplinary field compared to the evolution of a core field of computer science. Okay. So the next slide actually tries to motivate you why one should go for interdisciplinary research in computer science. So all this time I have been stressing on the point that interdisciplinarity is the talk of the day. One should actually try to do research in interdisciplinarity, and there is a lot of fame and name in doing interdisciplinary research. This particular slide actually gives you some indication of that fact. So what you see here is in the top table you see some average statistics. So average number of papers written per field. So if you look at the core fields of computer science, so the core fields are the ones that are marked in red blobs here, and the interdisciplinary fields are the ones that are marked in green blobs here. So you see that the total number of papers, or roughly the average number of papers written in an interdisciplinary field, is much higher than those written in the core field of computer science. Further, average number of citations received by any paper in the interdisciplinary field is almost double that in the core field. So the probability that your papers will get highly cited, that you will become highly reputed, okay, your papers will be highly visible, your papers will be cited by other people, that probability actually gets enhanced or almost gets doubled from this, from whatever we see here. It gets almost double if you are working in an interdisciplinary field compared to a core field. Similarly, the average number of citations received by an author. So you can look at the average number of citations received by every paper in a field or every author in a field. So for if you consider from the author perspective, that also is actually higher for interdisciplinary authors than the core authors. And if you see the average number of citations received by a venue in interdisciplinary field, so interdisciplinary venues are conferences where interdisciplinary research is published, okay, whereas core venues are places where core areas of computer science research is published, okay. So what you see, the average number of citations in the interdisciplinary venues is much higher than in the core venues. But all these things looks very rosy, that is doing research in interdisciplinarity actually favors the number of citations that every individual paper or an individual author actually receives, okay. However, there is one point of caution here. Doing interdisciplinary research, doing good interdisciplinary research is actually very hard, because it is growing to be more and more competitive over the years. So what we see is that although it is the fact that receiving citations at the level of authors as well at the level of papers is more probable in interdisciplinary areas, at the same time publishing in a paper in an interdisciplinary venue is more difficult than publishing a paper in a core venue, okay. That is what we see in the bottom figures. So in the bottom figure, what we do is basically we shortlist 4 interdisciplinary venues and 4 core venues. So the 4 interdisciplinary venues are represented by the bold lines. World Wide Web is one of the top tier conferences in interdisciplinary research, which actually is dedicated to graph theory, security, social networks, properties of complex networks, etc. Then you have SIG-KDD, which is a data mining and databases conference, which is also known to be highly interdisciplinary, because it accepts papers again from graph theory, it accepts papers from social networks, etc. ICDM is again a data mining conference, and it is known to be highly interdisciplinary in nature. And then there is this 4th conference, which is called CVPR, Computer Vision and Pattern Recognition, which is also a very highly reputed conference in computer vision, graphics, image processing and pattern recognition. So all these are like interdisciplinary areas, known to be interdisciplinary venues, whereas the last 4, the broken ones represented by broken lines, are known to be core fields like POPL, FOCS. POPL is the top tier conferences in programming language. FOCS and STOC are top tier conference in algorithms and theory of computation, and NASDAQ is a top tier conference in operating systems. Now if you see on the left hand side, we show the number of papers that are submitted to each of this conference as you go over the years. So what you see is that the number of papers that are submitted to the interdisciplinary areas is way higher than the number of papers that are submitted to the core areas of computer science. On the other hand, if you see the number of papers that are accepted in the core areas, that is actually higher for the core areas, whereas it is much lower in the interdisciplinary areas. So basically these two figures together indicates that there is a high level of competition in the interdisciplinary areas. In interdisciplinary areas there are a large number of papers submitted, while there is only a very less number of papers accepted, whereas in the core areas there are lesser number of papers submitted, but a reasonably high fraction of them are accepted. So that means these two figures together tells you that there is a larger level of competition in doing research in interdisciplinary areas. So although, as I said, that there is a higher probability that you have citations, you gain citations by doing research in interdisciplinary area, but then publishing a paper in an interdisciplinary area is actually really harder, okay. So that actually gives you some idea about how to quantify interdisciplinarity and why one should be involved in more interdisciplinary research, okay. So the next thing that we will talk about is about the citation life cycle of a particular paper. So what we try to show you here in this first figure on this slide is the average profile of a citation, average profile of citation of a particular paper over the years. So initially when a paper is published, it tries to accumulate citations, and there is an acceleration in its citation, and at some point in time, say after 3 or 4 years, the citation value actually stabilizes, and then there is a steady decline, there is a exponential decay in the citation of the paper. So basically this is kind of, if you take any random paper from the computer science data set, you will roughly see this particular behavior. So what happens in this behavior, what we want to show is that initially there is a growing phase. So suppose a paper P is accepted in a particular venue and is published, then from the point of publication, initially there is an accelerating phase when the paper keeps on accumulating citations. Then there is a point, like in 3 to 4 years, there is a stabilization that happens. So the number of citations gets more or less stable, and then the number of citations for the rest of the time period actually is declining over time. So there is a acceleration phase, then there is a steady or stable phase, acceleration phase of citations, then there is a stable phase of citations, and then there is a decay phase. So in fact this observation was made long back, okay, like this observation was made as early as in 2000, when people tried to study the individual citation profiles of various papers, and from that derive measures like impact factor, which are based on the idea that a paper usually tends to get most of its citations in the first 3 years. After the first 3 years, a paper hardly gets any more citation. So this 3-year time window is actually a very important factor, and that actually goes into the definition of impact factor. So impact factor, if you look at the definition, it tries to look into the citation history of the last 3 years, and that 3 years is fixed, 3 or 5 years. So this 3 to 5 years is fixed based on the observation of the citation profile of different papers. Since researchers observed that most of the citations are accrued by a paper in the first 3 or to 5 years of its publication, that's why the impact factor time window is also kept to be 3 to 5 years. However, since we had this huge data set, we tried to further reinvestigate that whether this particular phenomena is true across all papers. However, what we observe is that the scenario is not so straightforward, and we basically see that apart from the citation profile that people have already observed, that researchers have already observed, the one that I show here in the red, in the first left hand side figure in red. So this is the one that is very similar to this particular figure. So this is the one where the paper actually accrues most of its citations in the first 3 to 4 years, 3 to 5 years roughly, and then there is a steady decline. However, apart from this particular citation profile, this particular behavior, there are other at least 4 identifiable behaviors. So what we see in the second one is that there are certain papers in our data sets which have 2 or more peaks. Here you have only a single peak, okay, and the peak is seen in between 0 to 5 years, okay. In this second one, which we call multiple peaks or peak mul, you have more than 2 peaks. The third one is a late peak scenario, where the peak is observed nowhere in between 1 and 5 years, but much later than 5 years. Then there is the fourth one, which is like a monotonically decreasing scenario, where the citations to the paper actually only decrease over time, and as a researcher you will never want to be in this particular bucket, okay, because you want your papers to have more and more citations, not less over time, okay. And then there is this fifth bucket, which is a very interesting bucket. What we see here is that the citations for the papers in this bucket actually only increase over time, which we call the monotonically increasing. So the citations never fall, never decay. So this is actually like papers which are kind of seminal papers. Here these papers actually keep on gaining citations over time. There is no decay of citations for this particular set of papers. So in the next part of the lecture we will see more interesting properties of these 5 different categories of papers.